The hospital corridor was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, like the pause before a storm. Michael Jackson walked slowly, hands clasped in front of him, his signature black loafers barely making a sound against the polished floor. He had come expecting a simple visit, a few smiles, perhaps a song or two. Instead, what he was about to witness would ignite a chain of events that would bring five of the most powerful, rival icons in music together for a night the world never saw coming. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. That October day in 1985 was supposed to be ordinary. Michael Jackson had just come off the seismic success of Thriller, the album that shattered every record and rewrote what pop stardom meant. He was exhausted, guarded, and constantly surrounded by security. But children's hospitals were one place where he felt safe, not because they protected him, but because they reminded him of something he feared losing forever: innocence. He walked into the first room and was met by a little girl with bright eyes and a body weakened by illness. She smiled when she saw him, not because he was Michael Jackson, the king of pop, but because he was someone who looked like he cared. He held her hand. He asked her name. He sang softly. In the next room, a boy with tubes running into his arms whispered that he loved Thriller, that he danced to Billie Jean whenever he could. Michael laughed, but inside something cracked. Room after room, bed after bed, he saw the same thing. Children who carried more pain in their small bodies than most adults would ever know, and yet still found reasons to smile. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. A nurse noticed tears on his cheeks. Later that night, in the quiet of his hotel room, Michael Jackson couldn't sleep. He kept seeing their faces. He kept hearing their voices. He kept asking himself the same question over and over: what more can I do? Michael Jackson had already given millions to charity. He had recorded "We Are the World" earlier that year, gathering the biggest voices in music to fight famine in Africa. But something about this felt different. This wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about charts. This was about something deeply personal. This was about the children he had looked in the eyes and promised in his own soft voice that he would not forget them. And he didn't. What he imagined next was so bold, so improbable, that even those closest to him thought he was dreaming. Michael Jackson didn't just want to raise money. He wanted to create a moment so powerful, so unforgettable, that it would shake the world's conscience. He wanted a concert. Not just any concert, but a gathering of the most iconic, most competitive, most fiercely individual artists in music history. He wanted Prince. He wanted Madonna. He wanted Whitney Houston. He wanted George Michael. 5 superstars, 5 massive egos, 5 completely different musical universes, 5 artists who, on paper, had no reason to ever share a stage and every reason not to. Yet in Michael Jackson's mind, the image was already forming. He saw them standing together, shoulder to shoulder, their voices blending into something bigger than fame, bigger than rivalry, bigger than the industry itself. He saw hope. But dreams, especially dreams this large, don't come without resistance. At the time, Michael Jackson and Prince were the most legendary rivals in pop music. Their competition wasn't fueled by hatred, but by something more dangerous: mutual brilliance. Each pushed the other to new creative heights, and each guarded their own kingdom fiercely. Prince was famously private, resistant to collaboration, and suspicious of anything that felt staged or commercial. Madonna, on the other hand, was the queen of reinvention, unapologetic, provocative, and fiercely independent. Whitney Houston was the voice, unmatched, flawless, and carefully managed by an industry that protected her image like a priceless artifact. George Michael was redefining masculinity in pop, breaking boundaries with emotion, vulnerability, and soul. These weren't just artists, they were worlds. And Michael Jackson wanted to unite them. The first call went out quietly. Michael didn't want a public spectacle. He didn't want pressure. He wanted sincerity. He asked his team to reach out to Prince first. If Prince said yes, the rest might follow. If Prince said no, the dream could die before it even began. Prince's camp listened politely, then responded with hesitation. He was intrigued but cautious. He asked questions. He wanted to know who else was involved. He wanted to know what kind of music would be performed. He wanted control. He always wanted control. Michael Jackson, when he heard Prince was at least listening, felt a spark of hope. He drafted a personal letter, handwritten, carefully chosen words flowing from a place of vulnerability rather than ego. He didn't write as the king of pop. He wrote as a man who had seen children suffer and could not walk away. Meanwhile, Madonna was on the Like a Virgin tour, redefining what it meant to be a female pop star. Her image was bold, controversial, and unapologetically sexual. Some critics called her reckless. Some called her revolutionary. Michael Jackson saw her as fearless, exactly the kind of spirit he wanted on that stage. Whitney Houston was rising rapidly, her debut album making waves with its polished production and pristine vocals. She was being positioned as the face of crossover success, a bridge between pop, R&B, and adult contemporary. Her team was protective, cautious about anything that might disrupt her carefully constructed image. George Michael was in the midst of his own transformation. Wham! Had made him famous, but he was moving toward something deeper, more personal. His music was becoming more introspective, more soulful. He admired Michael Jackson deeply, but he also understood the risks of stepping into a project of this magnitude. Behind the scenes, phone calls multiplied, meetings were arranged, managers debated, lawyers asked questions, publicists raised concerns. Everyone saw the potential, but everyone also saw the danger. One wrong move could turn a charity effort into a media circus. And then there was Michael Jackson himself, fragile, sensitive, and already under intense scrutiny from the press. He was walking a thin line between genius and vulnerability, between global adoration and crushing isolation. But this dream gave him purpose. It gave him something to hold on to. One evening, alone in his studio, Michael sat at the piano. He began to play softly, letting his fingers wander over the keys. A melody emerged, gentle at first, then stronger. He began to hum. Words formed in his mind, not lyrics for a chart-topping single, but something more universal, more human. A song about unity, about healing, about standing together when the world feels broken. He stopped suddenly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "This is what they'll sing." The song was never recorded, never released, never even officially titled. But those who heard fragments of it later described it as haunting, tender, and powerful, the kind of song that feels like a prayer. As negotiations continued, something unexpected happened. Prince, after days of silence, sent a message back. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He said, "I want to hear the song." Michael Jackson almost dropped the phone. He recorded a rough demo that same night. No studio polish, no elaborate production, just his voice, a piano, and raw emotion. He sent it to Prince with no expectations, no pressure, no demands. Days passed. Then Madonna's camp responded. She was interested, but only if the project was real, meaningful, and not a publicity stunt. She wanted transparency. She wanted authenticity. She wanted to know that the money would truly reach the children it was meant to help. Michael welcomed her questions. He shared his hospital visit. He shared the names of the children he had met. He shared his tears. Madonna, known for her tough exterior, reportedly went quiet during the call. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "Okay," she said, "let's talk." Whitney Houston's team, initially hesitant, began to reconsider when they learned who else was being approached. The idea of Whitney Houston standing beside Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna, and George Michael was not just powerful, it was historic. Still, they wanted guarantees. They wanted control over sound, image, and messaging. They wanted to protect Whitney's voice, her brand, her future. George Michael, when he heard about the project, reportedly smiled. He admired Michael Jackson not just as an entertainer, but as a humanitarian. He had already supported charity efforts himself and understood the power of music to move hearts. He was open, cautiously, thoughtfully, but genuinely. And then the turning point came. Prince listened to the demo. Those close to him later said he played it more than once. He sat alone, headphones on, eyes closed. He didn't speak. He didn't react outwardly, but something shifted. When his team asked what he thought, Prince simply said, "It's real." That was all Michael Jackson needed. Within weeks, tentative agreements began to form. Nothing was signed. Nothing was announced. But the outlines of something extraordinary were taking shape. A venue was being discussed. A date was being tentatively marked. Late October 1985. The world, completely unaware, continued on as usual. The charts were filled with hits. The tabloids chased scandals. The industry spun endlessly. But behind closed doors, five giants were slowly moving toward a single point in time. Rehearsals were planned in secret. Not all artists would rehearse together at first. The logistics were too complicated, the egos too delicate. Instead, individual sessions were arranged. Michael rehearsed his parts alone. Whitney rehearsed with her vocal coach. George worked through harmonies. Madonna experimented with phrasing and attitude. Prince, ever elusive, practiced privately, sending notes through intermediaries rather than showing up in person. Yet even in this fragmented process, something magical was happening. Each artist was being challenged in ways they hadn't been before, not to compete, but to collaborate. Not to outshine, but to blend. Michael Jackson, in particular, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For once, he wasn't chasing perfection for the sake of fame. He was chasing something deeper, connection. One night after a long rehearsal, Michael sat alone in the empty studio. The lights were dim. The instruments were silent. He thought again of the children's hospital. He thought of the girl who smiled despite her pain. He thought of the boy who danced to Billie Jean in his hospital bed. He thought of the promise he had made not out loud but in his heart. "I'm doing this for you," he whispered. But the closer the date came, the heavier the pressure became. Rumors began to circulate, nothing specific, just whispers. Something big is happening. Michael is planning another charity project. There's talk of a secret concert. The press, always hungry, began sniffing around. Paparazzi followed Michael more aggressively. Managers grew nervous. Security was tightened. Inside the industry, skepticism grew. Some executives doubted that five superstars could truly share a stage without conflict. Some questioned whether the public would believe in the sincerity of such an event. Some feared backlash if the project failed. And then there were the artists themselves. Madonna worried about losing control of her image. Whitney worried about vocal strain. George worried about being overshadowed. Prince worried about artistic compromise. Michael worried about everything, about letting people down, about being misunderstood, about the project collapsing under its own weight. One by one, cracks began to appear. First, Whitney Houston's team raised concerns about scheduling conflicts and vocal health. She was booked solid, with studio sessions, promotional appearances, and live performances. The idea of a massive charity concert, with intense rehearsals and emotional strain, made them uneasy. Then Madonna's team expressed concerns about the concert's creative direction. They wanted assurances that her presence wouldn't be reduced to a background role. Madonna herself wanted to make a statement, not just stand and sing. George Michael's team worried about international logistics. He was based in the UK, and the concert was planned for the United States. Travel, scheduling, and commitments created complications. And Prince, despite his initial interest, remained distant. He hadn't confirmed his participation. He hadn't declined either. He existed in a space of possibility and uncertainty. Michael Jackson felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He began to withdraw, spending more time alone, retreating into his music and his thoughts. Those close to him noticed the change. He was quieter, more introspective, more fragile. One evening, his longtime collaborator sat beside him in the studio and gently asked, "Are you okay?" Michael looked down at his hands and said softly, "I don't want this to fall apart." Weeks passed, then days. The date loomed closer. And then suddenly, everything unraveled. Whitney Houston's team officially withdrew. They cited scheduling conflicts and vocal health concerns. They emphasized their respect for Michael Jackson and the cause, but the decision was firm. Madonna's camp, upon hearing this, grew more hesitant. Without Whitney, the balance shifted. The vision of 5 voices became 4, and that changed everything. George Michael remained willing, but his team expressed concern about the project's stability. Without full commitment from all parties, they worried about the event's viability. And Prince never officially declined. He simply stopped responding. The silence was devastating. Michael Jackson received the news alone, late at night, in a quiet room filled with half-written lyrics and unfinished dreams. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor. His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't just disappointment, it felt like grief. Not grief for a concert, but grief for something deeper, for a vision of unity that now seemed impossible. For a moment when rivals could stand together and show the world what compassion looked like at the highest level of fame. For the children he had promised in his heart that he wouldn't forget. Michael Jackson cried. Not the kind of tears that come and go, but the kind that come from the deepest place. The place where hope and heartbreak live side by side. The project was quietly abandoned. No press release, no announcement, no explanation. The world would never know how close it had come to witnessing the most powerful charity concert in music history. But the story didn't end there. Because even though the concert never happened, its impact did. Michael Jackson, shaken but not defeated, redirected his energy. He continued his charity work with renewed urgency. He visited more hospitals. He donated more quietly. He funded programs without seeking attention. He recorded more music with messages of healing, unity, and love. We Are the World had already shown what was possible when artists came together. But this unrealized concert showed something else, that even when dreams fail, the intention behind them still matters. Years later, in interviews, collaborators would speak of that mysterious project. They would hint at something extraordinary that almost happened. They would describe secret meetings, powerful conversations, and a song that never saw the light of day. Some would say it was better that it never happened, that the mythology of what could have been was more powerful than any concert ever could be. Others would say it was a tragedy, a lost opportunity, a moment of unity that the world desperately needed. But for Michael Jackson, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone in wanting to make a difference, even when the world made it difficult. It was a reminder that compassion is not measured by outcomes, but by intention. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts of love happen quietly, without applause, without cameras, without recognition. In the years that followed, Michael Jackson continued to face immense challenges. His life became increasingly complex, increasingly scrutinized, increasingly misunderstood. But at the core of it all remained the same childlike heart, the same heart that walked into a hospital in October 1985 and walked out changed forever. He never forgot that day. He never forgot those children. And he never stopped trying to heal the world. Somewhere in an old tape archive, that unreleased demo may still exist, a fragile recording of a dream that never came true. A song meant to be sung by 5 voices, now echoing only in memory. A song that reminds us that even the greatest stars are still human, still searching, still hopping, still trying to make sense of a world that often feels broken. And perhaps, in a way, that is the true legacy of that impossible night. Not the concert that never happened, but the compassion that inspired it. Not the stage that was never built, but the hearts that were already touched. Michael Jackson once said, "If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change." In October 1985, he did exactly that, not in front of a crowd, not under bright lights, but in a quiet hospital hallway, holding the hand of a child who believed in him. And that belief, that love, that moment changed everything. The silence that followed the collapse of that impossible concert lingered far longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the kind of silence that fades with time, but the kind that settles deep inside, a quiet echo of what almost was, whispering through every decision Michael Jackson made afterward. He didn't speak publicly about it. There was no press conference, no statement, no attempt to explain. To the world, nothing had happened. But inside Michael, something had shifted permanently. The dream of unity he had carried into that hospital hallway in October 1985 had not died, it had simply transformed. In the months that followed, Michael Jackson began spending more time away from the spotlight, retreating into private spaces where the noise of fame couldn't reach him. His studio became his sanctuary again, not a factory of hits, but a refuge of emotion. He began writing music that felt different, less about rhythm and spectacle, and more about healing, sorrow, and quiet hope. Those close to him noticed the change. The songs were softer, the melodies more fragile, the lyrics less about fame and more about humanity. One night, while sitting alone at his piano, Michael played the melody that had once been meant for Prince, Madonna, Whitney, and George. He didn't sing the words, only the tune. It filled the room with a sadness so gentle it almost felt like comfort. When he finished, he closed the piano lid slowly, as if sealing a memory inside. The children he had met never left his thoughts. He asked his team to arrange more hospital visits, not for cameras, not for publicity, but in secrecy. Sometimes he went in disguise. Sometimes he went late at night. Sometimes he went alone. He would sit by bedsides, listen to stories, draw pictures, sing softly, and hold hands. He gave gifts quietly. He paid medical bills without leaving his name. He funded treatments, research, and recovery programs without asking for recognition. To those children, he was Michael Jackson, the superstar. He was just Michael. But the world outside his private acts of kindness grew louder, harsher, more demanding. The media scrutiny intensified. Every move he made was analyzed, criticized, and sometimes distorted. Rumors grew. Speculation spread. The line between reality and perception blurred. And through it all, Michael Jackson continued to walk a fragile tightrope, trying to remain the gentle soul he had always been, while surviving the pressure of global fame. Yet even in the midst of that storm, echoes of that unrealized concert continued to ripple outward. Years later, Madonna would speak in interviews about the importance of unity in music, about the responsibility artists carry to use their voices for something bigger than themselves. She never named the project directly, but those who knew could hear its shadow in her words. Prince, famously private, rarely spoke about collaborations, but in rare moments he hinted at a project that almost happened, one that was pure, honest, and not about charts. He never said Michael Jackson's name, but he didn't have to. The meaning was clear. Whitney Houston, in quieter interviews, spoke about the importance of charity, faith, and using her voice to uplift others. She spoke of missed opportunities and lessons learned. Some who were close to her believed she carried regret, not because the concert failed, but because she had felt its potential. George Michael, more openly reflective, spoke in later years about the power of music to unite people across cultures, genres, and identities. He spoke about the beauty of vulnerability, about choosing compassion over competition. And those who had been in the room during those early discussions knew that his words were not abstract, they were personal. The unrealized concert became a kind of myth inside the industry, a whispered legend, a story shared in hushed tones among producers, managers, and musicians. Not as a failure, but as a symbol of what could happen when artists dare to imagine something beyond themselves. For Michael Jackson, however, it was never a myth. It was a memory, tender, painful, and sacred. There were nights when he would lie awake, replaying conversations in his mind. What if Whitney had said yes? What if Prince had stepped into the studio? What if Madonna and George had stood beside him under the lights? What if the world had witnessed that moment of unity? But Michael didn't allow himself to live in regret for long. He had learned something deeper from that experience, that unity doesn't always require a stage. That impact doesn't always need applause. That healing can happen quietly in the spaces no one sees. And yet, the dream never fully left him. Years later, when he began working on new music with messages of global unity, environmental awareness, and human connection, fragments of that abandoned project found their way into his work. The spirit of that unrealized concert lived on in songs that spoke of healing, saving the world, and standing together against injustice. He didn't name the inspiration. He didn't need to. The emotion was there. And then something unexpected happened. One evening, while reviewing old recordings, Michael stumbled upon the demo he had sent to Prince all those years ago. The tape crackled slightly, the sound imperfect, but the emotion was untouched. As he listened, he felt tears rise again, not tears of sorrow this time, but tears of remembrance. He remembered the hospital hallway. He remembered the children. He remembered the dream. He turned to his assistant and said quietly, "This was supposed to change everything." His assistant asked, "Do you wish it had happened?" Michael paused. "I think," he said slowly, "it already did." Because even though the concert never happened, it changed the way Michael Jackson saw his own role in the world. It shifted his purpose from entertainer to healer, from performer to protector of innocence. It deepened his compassion, sharpened his awareness, and strengthened his resolve to use his voice for those who could not speak for themselves. The unrealized concert became a silent compass, guiding his decisions, shaping his music, influencing his philanthropy. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded him that even the most powerful people in the world are still bound by human limitations: fear, doubt, conflict, timing, and circumstance. But that didn't mean the dream was meaningless. In fact, its meaning grew stronger with time. Because in a world obsessed with outcomes, with success, with visibility, the story of that impossible night offered a different lesson. That intention matters more than result, that compassion matters more than applause, and that unity begins not on a stage, but in the heart. Michael Jackson understood this deeply. He once said, "Love is my message." And that message was never louder than in the moment he chose to walk into a children's hospital, expecting nothing, and walked out carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Years later, when the world would look back on his life, they would see the spectacle, the controversy, the brilliance, the mystery. But beneath all of that was a story few truly understood, the story of a man who tried, in his own fragile way, to bring his rivals together not for fame, but for healing. And though the concert never happened, the spirit behind it never faded. It lived on in the children whose lives he touched. It lived on in the artists who were forever changed by the idea of unity, even if they never stood together on that stage. It lived on in the songs that continue to echo across generations, reminding us that the world can be healed, not by power, not by fame, but by love. The unrealized night became a silent anthem, a song without a chorus, a stage without lights, a crowd without applause, but a message that never stopped singing. And perhaps, in a way, that is what made it eternal. Because the greatest concert the world never saw didn't need a stage to exist. It existed in a hospital hallway. It existed in a quiet studio. It existed in a handwritten letter. It existed in a fragile demo. It existed in the hearts of 5 artists who, for a brief moment, stood on the edge of something extraordinary and learned something profound. That even in rivalry, there can be respect. Even in difference, there can be unity. Even in silence, there can be music. Michael Jackson carried that music with him for the rest of his life. And now, decades later, when we look back at his legacy, not just as the king of pop, but as a humanitarian, a dreamer, a wounded soul, and a gentle heart, we can see the invisible threads that connect his greatest songs to his quietest acts. We can see how a single hospital visit in October 1985 shaped not just a concert that never happened, but a life that continued to seek healing in a broken world. And perhaps that is the true ending of this story. Not a standing ovation, not a sold-out stadium, not a record-breaking broadcast, but a man sitting alone at a piano, playing a melody no one else can hear and knowing, deep in his heart, that it still matters. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments in history are the ones that never happen, but change us anyway. And sometimes, the greatest stories are not the ones we witness, but the ones we feel. Michael Jackson felt it. And now so do we.